Now to Afghanistan, where a bomb blast and a mortar attack have killed 10 civilians in the country where violence shows no signs of abating. The bombing in Helmand province killed 7 people and wounded 3 others. No group has as yet claimed responsibility for the blast, but authorities say the Taliban militants have a strong presence in the region. The mortar attack hit a market in eastern Logar province, killing 3 civilians and wounding 4 others. It happened during a battle between Afghan security forces and the Taliban. It's unclear which side fired the mortar. Crossing over to New York, joined by Mr. Ian Williams from the Foreign Policy in Focus Group. Thanks so much for being with us. I mean, it's still every day, just about on a regular basis, unfortunately, we're still talking about bombings and violence in Afghanistan. What is it going to take to turn this around? The Americans have been there basically for forever, and we see that actually the violence just continues to increase.
Well, it's difficult to conceive of a solution with the Americans staying there for any length of time. The ineptitude in peacemaking is incredible. They might have had some initial justification for going into Afghanistan, but they went in, as so often, with no plans, no foresight, no understanding of the culture. They used local warlords as surrogates who were not the most popular people in the world. These were the people who made the Taliban possible because they were so unpopular, the warlords beforehand. And they've installed a series of kleptocratic governments. They've condoned all sorts of undemocratic practices. So they're not actually giving ordinary Afghans something to fight and risk their lives for. And in the meantime, it's quite clear that both sides have a military doctrine that takes no heed whatsoever of civilian casualties on one side or the other. It is no way to win hearts and minds to drop mortar bombs on them, whichever side did it.
And now, I mean, what really is it to do? I mean, we see so many problem areas in the world. And I mean, Afghanistan has been on the list, as I said, for decades now. And we see, of course, word of mouth and saying that they have to do different measures in order to decrease the violence. But in the interim, I want to talk about the Afghan people themselves. For how long do they have to continue to do this? And on the other hand, we know the other side of the coin now, especially if we're talking about either Europe or the United States, even these poor people who may want to even leave their country and try to immigrate somewhere else, that basically they're being blocked and considered terrorists. It seems that they're in a basically lost situation, whichever way they go. What about the Afghan people? What's key here for them?
I think peace and security. And one of the things, the Taliban is always considered to be fundamentalist, and that's the expression it takes. But there are other people from Afghanistan who feel that it's more a case of sort of Pashtun tribalism or nationalism against in connection with the other groups, and that needs to be addressed. And it comes back to the fundamental point on all of these engagements, is that the US and surrogates refuse to talk to people. Many people say that, yes, there could be a deal with the Taliban, you know, that they could be accommodated, that they can be accommodated. Of course, you know, that the human rights component is extremely important there, but the US has not shown itself that sedulous of human rights in other circumstances. No, they can come to agreements. And you just have to think back 20 or 30 years to the sort of the fairly vibrant cosmopolitan culture of Kabul and Afghanistan and compare it with now. There are far too many compromises, far too much horse trading between kleptomaniac groups in the government. Very few, there's very little, there's no rule of law in Afghanistan, and what law there is pretty barbaric and medieval compared with what has existed. We know there's the groundwork, how should we say, there are foundations there in Afghanistan for a prosperous, thriving social and economic entity, but it's continually thwarted, and a spasmodic interruption by troops in response to electoral pressures back home in the US is not the way to deal with it.
Thank you so much for being with us out of New York, Mr. Ian Williams, with Foreign Policy in Focus.